Hello everyone, this is part 13 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Once Naruto had departed the small arena, the Anbu guard wearing a chameleon mask keeping watch to the Sandaim's right dispelled his shadow clone. The Hokage's new orders had made the blonde abandon his Chunin exam hoax and assume his new place on Yamato's squad sooner than planned. Though Naruto had looked to be disgruntled with his situation as he exited, the real demon vessel couldn't have cared less. He had no particular interest in beating down on some average genin in this little tournament. Even Sabaku no Gaara and his siblings were rather irrelevant to Naruto without his earlier mission to consider. The blonde would have killed them all without hesitation because he had been ordered to do so and still would whenever the Sandaime again gave the command, but the young operative bore the Suna trio no real personal hatred. The QB on the other hand was irritated with now being denied what the Ninetales viewed as his right to spill Shukaku's blood, but the coming invasion would give both demon and carrier ample chance to satiate their peculiar desires well enough regardless. Still, the demonic blonde couldn't help being curious as to Sarutobi's reasoning in recalling the assassination. The opening match in these preliminaries will be, Aburame Shino vs Akadu Yoroi. All remaining candidates and instructors are to clear the arena and proceed to the viewing areas. Hayat looked at the large electronic scoreboard that had been revealed moments earlier as he announced the initial match. The battles seemed to be decided through a random computerized assortment, though had the blonde been in charge over the tournament he would have seized on the opening to rig some pairings against the Suna and Oto competitors. He and the Hokage remained along with the other Anbu, the violet-haired Kunoichi who had questioned Yamato's call during the Orochimaru incident in the second exam. Azuki Yuga was her name, Naruto now knew. He had gone through the whole introduction routine with his new squad the previous morning. The other Anbu hadn't seemed to hold his actions in the woods against him, though almost the entire team except the squad leader harbored doubts as to whether some wet behind the ears Gaki had what it took to be in the Black Ops. The demon container didn't blame them, as even he wasn't sure that he belonged. But there he was, and all he could do was his best. Sarutobi had assigned him to this lax honor guard post in order to allow him to at least watch his previous teammates compete alongside the other rookie genin, as well as giving him the chance to observe the Sand siblings in combat, in case rubbing them out was to become his mission once more. Well now, we have two chakra drainers. This ought to be an interesting contest. Naruto didn't respond to the Sandaime's comment as he watched the other competitors exiting the ground arena, in particular keeping his gaze on what used to be his team. Kiba was glowering with his arms crossed as he glanced back at the entrance, and the blonde knew that he'd be hearing it the next time he saw the Inuzuka without his new lizard mask. He'd used a special chemical lotion designed to distort his scent while taking his morning shower, so that the mutt wouldn't be able to smell him during the matches. Kiba didn't need to be preoccupied with him right now. Kurenai wore a worried expression as her crimson eyes gravitated towards the same spot, and the woman's stance indicated that she seemed torn between wishing that she could go out and chase Naruto down to demand an explanation and knowing that her remaining two students needed her support more during their matches. Logic prevailed in the end and the Genjutsu mistress stayed put. Ino looked quite downcast and at that point the demon carrier experienced a little remorse over the subtle ruse he'd pulled. He had been ordered to maintain silence about his promotion, but still hoped that his actions wouldn't impact the blonde Kunoichi's mental state during her coming bout. Someday I'll explain everything. You guys deserve that much at least. Meanwhile, Shino and the bandana-wearing Yoroi were set to compete. The Aburame remained still with his arms DRD to his sides, appearing all too nonchalant about the contest. Naruto could almost sense the older opponent's smirk behind his cloth mask as he began concentrating chakra into his hand as he tensed the appendage into a claw. Hayat gave the signal to begin and Yoroi went on the attack. The elder Konoha genin clawed at Shino with his chakra-enhanced hand in an attempt to grab the insect user, who avoided a couple attempts but was soon latched into Yoroi's iron grip. It's all over. Once I've got you in my clutches there's no way to escape, now say goodbye to your chakra, kid. The Aburame showed no reaction, not that that was unusual with the Hivemaster. Naruto couldn't be certain what his opponent was doing, but according to the Hokage's prognosis and Yoroi's own words, he looked to be attempting to siphon Shino's chakra reservoir into nothingness. However, the bandana-wearing genin seemed to be so caught up in his imminent success that he didn't bother to notice the innumerable Kikaichu swarming out through the Aburame onto the ground and then over onto him. The insect user stared at his occupied opponent. Your chakra absorption technique is indeed potent. At that moment, Shino's bugs began devouring Yoroi's chakra instead, as the massive swarm consumed the other genin's power at a rate that his own drainage could not even begin to match. Within a minute, the Akadu's grip loosened and he sank unconscious to the ground. Once it became apparent that the Yoroi wasn't going to continue, the Aburame recalled his insect helpers, looking down at his unmoving opponent as he pushed his sunglasses up his nose and concluded in an emotionless tone. But nowhere near as potent as mine. Oyasumi Nasai. Heiat's decision wasn't needed at all, as evidenced when the medics came in to haul the motionless Yoroi to the hospital in order to receive chakra exhaustion treatment. Shino started walking onto the viewing area to where his team was waiting. Kakashi acknowledged his student's win with a silent nod, while Sasuke was still preoccupied with attempting to bore a hole down into the arena with his eyes. The Uchiha's Sharingan appeared to have activated without his knowledge due to the raven-haired shinobi's blind rage. Shusha. Aburame Shino. The scoreboard ran through its routine again, selecting Tenten and some genin named Kintsuchi as the next match. Team Guy's Kunoiki entered down into the arena with a poised and determined expression. Her opponent was likewise a girl, the sole one on the Hidden Sound team. The masked Naruto spared Kin a glance as she descended the stairs. She was an attractive, though somewhat hard-looking brunette dressed in gorilla garb. Her two male teammates seemed as though neither could have cared less about her match, as the pair was conversing between themselves and not even looking at the arena. Their instructor had vanished at some point as well. That Oto bunch doesn't really look like they've got a very cohesive unit. Sarutobi nodded at the demon vessel's quiet remark and trailed the rookie ANBU's vision over to where the two remaining sound genin were leaned against the wall, still absorbed in their private discussion in the upstairs viewing area. The old man's eyes narrowed in guarded suspicion at what Naruto guessed to be his noticing that the Oto squad's sensei had taken his leave. The blonde's Kunoiki squad member was the one to give a verbal response to his comment. Well, however lacking their team dynamic might be, it's obvious that it's been at least good enough to get them through 2 exam portions intact. Naruto shrugged, conceding the minor point to the older woman without having to come right out and admit to it, and then redirected his attention towards the arena. The two genin Kunoiki had the gazes locked, each attempting to intimidate the other. Naruto didn't like to bother with mind games like those in a serious battle. He would have attacked without warning. Heiat began the match, and both girls moved to retrieve weapons at the same time. Tenten was much quicker on the draw and managed to take out her storage scroll and produce a long Naginator Polyim while her opponent still had her hand stuck inside a Senbon pouch at her side. This match won't last long. Tenten's not going to lose in a weapons contest. The blonde shinobi's internal observation coincided with Tenten closing distance with her opponent and almost decapitating the Oto genin with her Naginator. Kin dodged to the side and tossed 3 needles with poor aim in the other girl's general direction, but the weapons user turned and twirled her polyim about and batted all the incoming missiles to either side with practiced ease. 1 needle landed near where Naruto was standing with Sarutobi and Yugao. The Senbon was attached to a string and had a small bell connected to the end. A strange decoration, though perhaps it had a more sinister purpose. Not that it mattered, as the Sound Nin was on the run and leapt backwards as Tenten slashed at her with the Naginator. Kin bit out a curse as the steel Kunoiki shouldered her Seabursum weapon with one arm and withdrew and tossed 3 shuriken at the girl with the other. Tenten's aim was solid as a rock, and all 3 shinobi stars would all have struck separate vital organs had Kin not done a kawarimi in desperation. The mismatch does seem to be rather apparent here. The other honor guard present also had a short but important comment to add to the Hokages. She's got some incredible aim with those shuriken. We might want to start keeping a close watch on that girl. She's a natural assassin. Naruto hadn't ever given much thought to the matter, but realized that Yugao's observation held some truth. Tenten's prodigious SK with throwing weapons made her a most viable candidate to be recruited into the Black Ops at some point, perhaps giving her even more raw potential in that regard than Naruto had. An instantaneous K with a needle or throwing star was seen as being more optimal compared to an outright battle. Anbu wasn't going to come right out and induct her now, as Tenten still needed much more seasoning and all-around improvement, but she might well be wearing an animal mask as an adult kunoichi. That's some high praise. And here I'd thought one couldn't make it into Anbu without getting through the regular shinobi ranks as a prerequisite. The Hokage let out a slight smirk at the masked blonde's sarcastic remark about his own position as he withdrew his pipe and loaded it with tobacco. The old man and his two Anbu guards kept the shared comments restricted to low tones to avoid potential eavesdroppers. Back in the arena, Kin reappeared behind Tenten and again threw her odd senbon at the weapon's user. This time the thin missiles streaked straight towards the other girl rather than being spread out over a general area. The small bells tinkled in the air as the needles careened along their path, but still did no damage as Tenten raised the Naginator and intercepted the senbon with the polearm's blade, again causing them to clatter onto the ground. The Oto Genin rushed and tried to baseball slide in order to knock out her opponent's legs, but Tenten hopped over the attack and turned about in midair, raising the Naginator high over her head and bringing the weapon down onto Kin's position with both hands. Kutetsu no Entotsu. The Kyuubi vessel might have quirked an intrigued eyebrow underneath his personalized chameleon mask, but didn't bother since such an invisible gesture would have been meaningless. Team Guy's kunoichi concentrated as much chakra as her steel weapon could tolerate as she descended through the air, releasing it into the ground as the Naginator made contact. Kin dodged and avoided the actual blade, but not the chakra. Rather than compacting into a missile and streaking along beneath the ground towards a designated location as with Naruto's blade technique, Tenten's chakra exploded on contact and spread outward in a conical shape, tearing apart the earth wherever it touched and raining stone shards throughout the arena. Her steel funnel sent the opposing sound kunoichi cascading high into the air like a helpless doll, spinning about like a top until she landed on her side with a sickening thud and her head snapped against the ground. Though still conscious, Kin was unable to regain her bearings and a somewhat winded Tenten moved in brandishing the Naginator and pointed the polearm's blade between the Oto Genin's black glassed-over eyes. The same principle as mine, but applied in reverse. I should have thought about that. Tenten's variation on Naruto's original technique had devastating potential, though it compromised the long range that had made the move appeal to him to begin with. The young weapons user had been instrumental in helping to mold the Demon Carrier's missile version into its optimum state to begin with, and so he wasn't bothered that she since adopted the method into her arsenal as well. Hayate announced the match as being over and the scoreboard then decided the next contest. Shusha, Tenten. And the next match will be Tsurugi Misumi vs Yamanaka Ino. Mato Guy and his clone both cheered loud enough to disturb the S at their teammates' one-sided exhibition, as it had never been an actual match, while Hyuga Neji cast an approving glance and then stared down at the ground scowling with his arms crossed. The white-eyed genius seemed to be rather embarrassed about having to be seen in their presence. Tenten returned her chosen weapon into its scroll and moved to help her beat an opponent back upright. Naruto would never have even bothered with making such a sportsmanlike gesture, but neither would the blonde criticize his sparring partner over her competitive mindset. Kin seemed willing to accept the helping hand, but then shoved it aside in anger once she became coherent enough to remember her humiliating loss and prowled back over to her own squad. Tenten shrugged and returned to the viewing area as well. Neither male sound nin showed Kin much consideration. A brown-haired kid with some weird implants on his hands sneered at the girl's weakness while the obvious squad leader with the bandages wrapped around his head and a metal gauntlet girded on his wrist outright ignored her. Not that Naruto had much right to criticize them, seeing as he had more or less bailed on his own team at this critical moment. The Oto instructor was still nowhere to be seen. You'd better not even think about losing this match, Ino pig. We never got to settle our issues last time. Naruto might have scowled at Haruno's loud-shouted comment as the pink-haired kunoichi leaned over the railing, except that it seemed to have a positive impact on Ino. There had been a somewhat distracted and uncertain look in Yamanaka's eyes as the girl ambled down into the arena, but her rival somehow managed to rekindle that competitive spirit. The Demon Carrier had long thought it rather peculiar, and also somewhat ridiculous, that certain people could both incense and inspire one another at the same time. The blonde had no rival, as it were. Naruto doubted that he ever would. Ino paused in her tracks and then glanced and gave a nonchalant wave over her shoulder to the other girl as she took her position in the arena. Fretting too much will give you wrinkles, Sakura. And you're repulsive enough as it is. Yamanaka's opponent was not in the least amused with her and Sakura's banter. Tsurugi Misumi wore glasses and a black bandana like his teammate Akadu Yoroi, whom Shino had bested earlier in the opening match. Naruto wondered whether this genin was as weak and one-dimensional as his identical partner. A shinobi who was aged well into his 20s and somehow still ranked as a genin had to be rather lacking in talent in the masked blonde's opinion. That, or lacking so much in drive and ambition that he might as well not even bother continuing. Leave your childish arguments at home, little girl. These are the Chunin exams. Said girl placed a hand against her hip as her cerulean eyes glared over at Misumi, who seemed to be less than impressed with her chilled expression. Don't patronize me or I'll make you regret it, Barker. I've trained hard to make it here. The adult male Konoha genin dropped down into a tense combative stance and sneered back at the much smaller Kunoiki, or at least Naruto thought that Misumi might have been sneering underneath his black bandana. You've sure got a big mouth on you, princess. For your sake, you'd best also have the SKS to back it. Hayate coughed and halted the banter, sending both match genin a reproving look. Enough talk now. Let the third match begin. Misumi's dark orbs glittered with malice beneath his glasses as he attacked Ino. The Yamanaka avoided a punch and blocked a kick that still sent her skidding backwards. Tsurugi didn't advance as he swung outward with both arms. Naruto seed his head in amusement, almost chuckling underneath his mask. That idiot was punching at mere air. Ino seemed to have about the same opinion, snorting as she dug her bandage-wrapped legs into the ground and regained her balance. However, their mutual disdain was silenced when Tsurugi's arms extended to reach their target. Ino was too surprised to react in time, and the initial punch sank deep into her stomach and knocked her wind out while the other then impacted with her skull and sent her crashing onto the ground. Naruto's expression soured at seeing Misumi's contortion SKS, as the older genin's exotic technique was identical to one that a certain snake-like opponent had used. Something about this contest seems to be bothering you. Sarutobi exhaled his pipe smoke and addressed his stoic companion. The blonde didn't like having to watch his ex-teammate being knocked around, though he had no intention to get involved. Furthermore, Naruto didn't trust this Misumi character or his apparent technical connection to Orochimaru. Contortion was a rather obscure talent that one didn't go out and learn through reading some random scroll. Tsurugi and his teammate Yoroi were both a little too old to be the usual genin. And then there was their genin squad's third member, that Yakushi Kabuto who seemed to know several things that some shinobi with his low rank shouldn't know and had later quit his place in the Chunin exams despite bearing no obvious wounds on his person. Something smelled rotten about the trio, and the demon carrier was suspicious about them. I recognized that contortion method. He used it against me back in the woods. The Hokage paused to consider the implications, but then shook his wizened head in the negative. Naruto allowed the matter to drop with that, since he had nothing damning to go on and the Sandaime no doubt knew much more about the three shinobi than he did. Perhaps he had been a bit too paranoid to suggest that a shared technique linked some genin to the snake Sannin. Meanwhile Misumi heaved his right leg high into the air, extending it with his contortion abilities and moving to bring it stomping down onto Ino with match-ending strength. Yamanaka managed to roll aside and avoid several sweeping kicks as she closed in on her opponent. The Kunoiki leapt at Misumi and capped a knee right between the older genin's eyes. Tsurugi's spectacles cracked and splintered, and the glass shards cut into him in several places. Ino then landed in an acrobatic split and back-elbowed him clear in the sack. Suck on that, you sister swipe. For a passing moment, the blonde wondered whether the other blonde had used some Yamanaka trademark jutsu to switch personalities with Kiba. Naruto glanced at the Inuzuka and caught the mutt wincing at that last blow. Kurenai was looking about as smug at that particular instant as she ever got. A smirking Ino moved in to seal the deal with a roundhouse kick to the head when Misumi contorted his waist and dodged the blow. The stretch artist then wrapped his elongating arms around Ino like a boa constrictor and clamped her into a twisting strangle hold. The older genin leered at her and grunted out a sinister taunt through a high-pitched voice. I should advise you to surrender now, but in this case I'm rather hoping you won't. The kunoichi struggled against the hold with all she could muster, and the demon vessel was more than willing to respect her determination. The Yamanaka Ino he had met at the Genin Academy that morning 6 months ago would have knuckled under in this situation without a second thought, which was evidence to how much the girl had matured between then and now. Despite her obvious toughness, she was still starting to wilt due to pain and air deprivation. Hey, it needs to stop this match. That girl's going to be strangled to death at this rate. Naruto wanted to argue with Yugao's muttered comment, but couldn't. Sarutobi did so instead, though the blonde had to agree with the other Anbu deep down. The demon container had never been one to advocate or even condone surrender in battle, as such a thing went against his personal nindu, but neither did he want to see Ino be ked over some ridiculous match. The Hokage observed the young kunoichi's plight with an interested gleam, taking another drag on his tobacco. Don't count her out right now. She's still got something up her sleeve, I can tell. Ino kicked and elbowed against Misumi's hold but wasn't able to make the enraged contortionist relent. Utilizing her last resort move, she moved her hand to her lower leg and withdrew Naruto's other ninjato that she had strapped onto her person. The rookie Anbu heard a sick popping sound as she did so. She had separated her own shoulder in order to get loose enough to get at her weapon, and thrust it deep into Misumi's leg. The opposing genin choked out a scream and released Yamanaka due to shock as crimson blood began dripping out along the shinobi sword's long hollowed handle and onto the ground. Ino tried to wrench the blade loose, the reasoning behind which Naruto presumed to be to worsen the bleeding, but Misumi trapped her wrist with one hand and backhanded her hard with the other. Yamanaka almost went limp in his vice grip but managed to retain consciousness. You little b. Tsurugi wrapped his hand around Yamanaka's tee as she spat out some blood what the demon carrier thought might be a molar, slamming the smaller girl into the distant stone wall with his limb extension SK. The girl smirked through a bleeding upper lip in response and the gesture seemed to anger the man more. I can't see what you're so smug about. I'll be sure to break that little N this time. A sizzling sound in Misumi's leg was the sole answer he received. The older genin squealed in immense pain when the blade embedded inside him began to heat. He reached to remove it, but wasn't quick enough about it. The explosive tag that Naruto had stored within the ninjato handle prior to the exam detonated at Ino's command, blowing Misumi's leg into pieces well above the knee along with the hand that had been rushing down to grasp the hollowed shinobi sword. Bone and scorched tissue showered all over the arena as a pungent odor hung in the air. Naruto didn't bother looking towards the spectators' area, as he was much more interested in the carnage in the arena, but the blonde could well enough imagine the various expressions that the other Konoha genin present wore. Misumi whimpered as the now crippled contortion expert thrashed about on the ground, cradling the charred and bleeding stump that had once been his right hand while the medics rushed in to render what little assistance could be given. Tsurugi Misumi cannot cough continue the match. Shusha. Yamanaka Ino. Naruto was impressed overall. That little stratagem had been downright ruthless and executed with precision. She had attempted to pull the ninjato out in order to trick her opponent into keeping it in and had then waited until he had created enough distance between them to ensure that she wouldn't get caught in the explosion. Ino held her separated shoulder as she returned to the viewing area, taking special care to avoid stepping through the gore littering the ground. In the end, she was still who she was, the masked Naruto realized. The blonde supposed that he could excuse some scruples. I guess she really did grow into a decent kunoichi while I wasn't watching. Even as the prelim matches took place within the tower, another man leaned against a wooden column beneath a covered outdoor walking path. Orochimaru was dressed in a black armored shinobi vest and pants, in his opinion a much less desirable alternative to his usual robes and sash, an amused sneer adorning the snake man's pallid visage. All those precious risks the snake Sannin had taken while sneaking into the examination tower with that shriveled old cadaver present had availed him next to nothing when his little kitsune had surrendered his right to continue. With his sole interest in the matches no longer competing, Orochimaru had taken his own leave prior to the opening match. But to place our Naruto-kun in the Black Ops, quite the unexpected move, old man. But not quite clever enough to fool me, I'm afraid. Sarutobi's smokescreen had almost taken Orochimaru in, loath though the man was to acknowledge it. However, the snake Sannin was connected in a limited manner to his chosen shinobi, those marked with his cursed seal. Orochimaru's own dark chakra had become rooted within Naruto-kun at the moment the Juin had activated back in the woods, rendering the gaki much easier to pinpoint so long as the distance between them was small enough. Uzumaki's own chakra was so distinctive that locating him was a simple matter even without the cursed seal. The yuki coursing through him was so much more potent than that sniveling Sabaku brat's. And when Orochimaru had still been able to sense all that delectable power within the room once, Naruto was long gone, he had seen right through the old baboon scheme. No matter how you dress him up, sensei, it won't change a thing. He will still be mine. A small hummingbird sailed into the area and landed on the snake Sanen's hand. Orochimaru's golden eyes stared with disinterest at the helpless little creature, still pondering the countless matters at hand. Naruto-kun's Juin was not progressing as the snake man wanted. Much the opposite, it seemed that the brat had somehow devolved the seal within him and pushed the cursed chakra into regress. Perhaps Kyuubi no Kitsune was proving to be less than willing to allow another presence within his host. And with Naruto-kun no longer participating in the tournament, it seemed that he would not become embroiled in a battle intense enough to push him into drawing on the seal again and allowing Orochimaru the chance to regain the lost ground. That had to be Sarutobi's plan, and the snake Sanen could do precious little to counter it. Attempting to encounter Naruto-kun a second time would be risking too much at this phase, more so due to the gaki being surrounded with other Anbu, his old genetic experiment in particular. Orochimaru had no choice other to wait until the coming month's attack in order to make progress there. Orochimaru-sama. The snake man turned towards the person who had addressed him, his pale hands moving together almost quicker than the eye could discern in order to execute an attack jutsu should the need arise. One couldn't be too cautious this deep within hostile lands. Orochimaru was almost disappointed when it turned out to be nothing more than Kabuto. The bespectacled man bowed low to his master and stood again as the serpentine shinobi leaned back against his wooden pole and crossed his arms. Ah, Kabuto-kun, I see that your grueling match hasn't exhausted you too much. Orochimaru let out a sinister chuckle as he taunted Kabuto's withdrawal. To the snake man's general irritation, the silver-haired medic smirked back at him. Too bad that Kabuto's particular SKS was so invaluable to his plans, as otherwise the snake Sanen might have endeavored to punish the insolent little gesture. The time wasn't right to show them what I can do. I couldn't risk the other side being exposed here. But I trust your plans have gone well. Orochimaru hummed in response, knowing well Kabuto-kun's unwillingness to compromise his precious cover. The serpent man couldn't have cared less, seeing little real point to remaining undercover in a village that would cease to exist within the month. Still, he would allow his operative to do as he pleased this time, not that Orochimaru could have done much about it now even had he cared to. There was no point in having him compete in that menial little tournament either, since Naruto-kun was no longer in contention. Well enough, some aspects have gone better than others. Sasuke-kun did not quite measure up to expectations. He is both weak and inexperienced. The Uchiha is no use to me as he is now. Uzumaki Naruto-kun on the other hand has proven to be stronger than I could have imagined. His immediate reaction to the cursed seal was most impressive. The snake man leered with detached amusement as Kabuto's argent brows rose as he considered the implications. No doubt he was contemplating whether or not Naruto-kun's power was enough to constitute a threat to his position. The man's acute danger senses made him most annoyingly paranoid in that regard. But those same senses made him an ideal mole. He could goad Kabuto into attacking the demon carrier, but the snake man wasn't much inclined to have his two most valuable shogi pieces maiming one another. Like a good little henchman, Kabuto also knew better than to ask Orochimaru to elaborate on Naruto-kun, or about his decision to wait on claiming Sasuke-kun. There were certain limits on the extent to which the snake Sanen was willing to indulge his underling's curious nature. Exceeding them came with promised pain. The Kyuubi child, I must admit, your sudden interest in Uzumaki-kun comes as a surprise. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.